There is a book in the Bible that most people have never read in full. It sits quietly between the triumphant conquest of Joshua and the tender poetry of Ruth. It is not often quoted in sermons. Its stories are rarely placed on greeting cards or read to children at bedtime. And yet it may be the most honest book in the entire Old Testament. It is the book of Judges, and within its pages lies something that the ancient scribes did not hide, did not soften, and did not explain away. They recorded what happened, all of it, the victories and the betrayals, the courage and the catastrophe, the moments when God moved through flawed, broken people, and the moments when an entire nation fell so completely into darkness that even the most hardened reader must pause and reflect on what they are witnessing. The book of Judges is not comfortable reading. It was never meant to be. It is a mirror, and what it reflects is not an ancient people in a distant land. It reflects the heart of humanity when it loses its anchor, when it forgets what it was called to be, and when every person does what is right in their own eyes. That final phrase is not metaphor. It is the theological verdict the book of Judges pronounces on itself, in its very last verse. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25. This is the story of 7 of the most difficult, most profound, and most spiritually significant passages hidden within that book. 7 truths that scholars approach with caution. 7 realities that the text does not flinch from, and neither will we. Before we can understand any single story in the book of Judges, we must understand the architecture of the entire book. Because the book of Judges is not simply a collection of stories arranged in sequence. It is a theology written in blood and consequence. The book operates on a cycle, and that cycle is one of the most brutal and honest assessments of human spiritual behavior ever recorded in sacred literature. The pattern repeats itself throughout the entire book, across generations and centuries, with a consistency that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The people of Israel would settle in the land. They would forget the Lord their God. They would turn to the gods of the surrounding nations, the Baals, the Ashtoreths, the false deities of Canaan. And then, the text records, the anger of the Lord would burn against Israel, and he would give them into the hands of their enemies. They would suffer, they would be oppressed, they would cry out, and God, in his mercy, would raise up a judge, a deliverer, who would rescue them. Then peace would return. Then the judge would die. Then the cycle would begin again. This is recorded not once, not twice, but across the entire span of the book, generation after generation. And what makes this cycle so disturbing is not the suffering that follows the abandonment of God. What is truly unsettling is the acceleration. With each turn of the cycle, the judges become more compromised. The sins of the nation become more severe. The darkness deepens. The first judge, Othniel, is described with almost no moral complexity. He is faithful. God's Spirit comes upon him. He delivers Israel. He judges the land for 40 years. The text speaks of him with measured reverence. But as the book progresses, the judges themselves become entangled in the same moral deterioration they were called to address. Gideon, the great deliverer, ends his life in spiritual compromise. Jephthah makes a vow that brings unbearable grief, and Samson, the last of the major judges, is consumed by personal desire from the moment he appears until the moment he dies. The cycle is not just a literary structure, it is a diagnosis. The book of Judges is documenting something that the ancient Israelites could not seem to escape, a gravitational pull toward spiritual amnesia, a tendency to forget, to drift, to replace the living God with the gods that required nothing of them. And every generation assumed the cycle would be different this time. Every generation was wrong. In the 4th chapter of Judges, something unusual occurs, something that the ancient world would have found deeply countercultural, and that the biblical text presents without apology or excessive explanation. A woman judges Israel. Her name is Deborah. She is described as a prophetess, as the wife of Lapidoth, and as one who would sit beneath a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, where the people of Israel would come to her for judgment. This was not a temporary arrangement. This was not a crisis measure presented with reluctance. The text simply states that she judged Israel at that time as a matter of settled, recognized authority. The historical context around her is one of severe oppression. For 20 years, Israel had been crushed under the military power of Jabin, king of Canaan, and his military commander, Sisera. Sisera commanded 900 iron chariots, a terrifying military force for that period in the ancient Near East. The roads had become dangerous, the people had been subdued, the nation had lost its capacity to resist. And so Deborah summoned a man named Barak from Kadesh Naphtali. She gave him a clear, direct command from the Lord. "Rise, take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. March to Mount Tabor. God will draw out Sisera and his chariots to the Kishon River, and he will give them into your hand." Barak's response reveals the spiritual condition of leadership in Israel at that moment. He would not go unless Deborah went with him. The text does not condemn him in harsh language, but Deborah's reply carries a profound weight. She tells Barak that she will indeed go, but that because of his hesitation, the honor of the victory will not rest on him. The Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. This is the first layer of the secret within this story. It is not simply that a woman judged Israel. It is that God moved through whomever was willing to move, and that the men who should have stepped forward had become uncertain, reluctant, dependent. The second layer deepens at the end of the battle. Sisera, the great military commander with 900 iron chariots, flees on foot when his army is routed. He finds shelter in the tent of a woman named Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Jael welcomes him. She covers him. She gives him milk when he asks for water. He falls into an exhausted sleep. And then Jael takes a tent peg and a hammer. The text of Judges 4 describes what she does with economy and without dramatic embellishment, and in Judges 5, the ancient song of Deborah commemorates this act as the fulfillment of the word God had spoken through Deborah. The honor of this victory, as Deborah had said, rested in the hands of a woman, of two women, in fact. A prophetess who led a nation when its male leaders faltered, and an ordinary woman in a tent who acted with decisive courage in a moment that altered the course of a war. What the book of Judges presents here is not an argument about gender roles or political structure. It presents something far more sobering. God is not constrained by human categories of who should step forward. When the willing are absent, he raises those who are willing. And he does not consult the expectations of the surrounding culture before doing so. The Song of Deborah in Judges 5 is one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the entire Hebrew Bible. Scholars date it to the 12th or 11th century before Christ. It sings of stars fighting from heaven, of rivers that rose against the enemy, of the blessing upon Jael and the grief of Sisera's mother waiting at a window that her son would never approach again. It is poetry that understands both triumph and tragedy simultaneously. It is the kind of victory song that knows the weight of what was required to sing it. Of all the judges in the book, Gideon may be the one whose story carries the most difficult spiritual lesson, because his story begins with such extraordinary faith and ends with such catastrophic failure. His beginning is memorable. He is threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding it from the Midianites, who have been raiding the land of Israel for 7 years, stripping it of its harvests, reducing the people to desperate poverty. The Midianites came like locusts, the text says, with their camels beyond number, so many that Israel was brought very low. And then the angel of the Lord appears. What the messenger says to Gideon is one of the most striking greetings in all of Scripture. "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." Judges 6:12. Gideon's response is entirely human. He does not leap to his feet with confidence. He questions. If the Lord is with us, he asks, why has all of this happened? Where are all his wondrous deeds that our fathers told us about? The angel does not answer the theological question directly. Instead, God commissions Gideon to go in this might and save Israel from Midian. Gideon asks for a sign, and this is where the texture of the story becomes important for the spiritual lesson it carries. God graciously provides the sign. Fire consumes the offering Gideon prepares, and Gideon, terrified, builds an altar and calls it, "The Lord is Peace." But his faith is still fragile, still requiring confirmation. The famous story of the fleece belongs to this season of Gideon's life. He asks God to confirm his word, once through dew on the fleece and dryness on the ground, and a second time through dryness on the fleece and dew on the ground. God, in his patience, provides both confirmations. Then God does something that seems to make the military situation worse before it gets better. Gideon assembles 32,000 men. God says there are too many. He reduces the army by allowing those who are afraid to leave. 22,000 depart. 10,000 remain. Still too many. God reduces the army further through the now famous test at the water, separating those who lapped water with their hands to their mouths from those who knelt down to drink. 300 men remain. 300 men against an army described as countless as the sand on the seashore. The story of what happens at Midian's camp that night is one of the most dramatic passages in the Old Testament. 3 groups of 100 men, torches hidden inside clay jars, trumpets, and then, at a signal in the darkness, the jars shattered, the torches blazed, the trumpets sounded, and 300 voices cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The Midianite camp collapsed into chaos. They turned against one another in confusion. They fled. Israel pursued them, and the victory was complete. It is the kind of story that communicates unmistakably that the victory belonged to God, not to the army. And for a moment it appears that Gideon understood this. When the men of Israel come to him afterward and offer to make him king, him and his son and his grandson, Gideon refuses. He speaks a sentence that sounds like pure theological clarity. "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Judges 8:23. This is the high point of Gideon's story, and then it begins to unravel. He asks for the gold earrings from the plunder, a single request that the people gladly fulfill. From that gold, Gideon makes an ephod. An ephod was a garment associated with the priestly function, used in seeking the will of God. But the ephod Gideon makes is placed in his hometown of Ophrah, outside of the authorized location of worship, and the text records its consequence with chilling brevity. All Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. Judges 8:27. The man who tore down his father's altar to Baal, the man who refused to be king and declared that the Lord would rule, the man who led 300 into impossible victory, that same man created an object that led the entire nation into spiritual prostitution. The book of Judges does not soften this, and after Gideon's death, the people returned immediately and completely to the worship of the Baals, as if nothing had happened, as if the 40 years of peace under Gideon's leadership had passed without leaving a mark on the spiritual memory of the nation. The deepest lesson Gideon's story carries is not about fleeces or torches or clay jars. It is about the difference between the moments when God moves through us and the transformation of the heart that must follow. Gideon experienced the presence of God in a way that few people in human history have experienced, and yet, at the end of his life, he left a legacy that pointed Israel away from the God who had delivered them. Faithfulness in a moment of crisis is not the same as a lifetime of faithfulness. The book of Judges understood this distinction, and it recorded the tragedy of forgetting it. There are passages in the Bible that demand more from the reader than simple comprehension. They demand stillness. They demand the willingness to sit in a moment of grief without reaching for an easy resolution. The story of Jephthah and his daughter in Judges 11 is one of those passages. Jephthah's background is itself a study in rejection and resilience. He was the son of Gilead and of a woman described only as a prostitute. His half-brothers drove him from his home, telling him he would have no inheritance in their father's house because he was the son of another woman. He fled to the land of Tob, where worthless men gathered around him, and he became their leader. His story begins with rejection, with displacement, with the world's judgment about who he was and what he deserved. And then Gilead needed him. The Ammonites had made war against Israel, and the elders of Gilead came to Jephthah in his exile and asked him to return as their commander. The same men who had driven him away now came asking for what he offered. Jephthah negotiated carefully. "If the Lord gives Ammon into my hand," he said, "then I will be your head." They agreed. Before he went into battle, Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, and this is where the text arrives at one of its most difficult moments. He vowed that if God would give the Ammonites into his hand, whatever came out of the doors of his house to meet him when he returned in peace would be the Lord's, and he would offer it as a burnt offering. The scholarly discussion surrounding this vow has continued for centuries. Some interpreters have suggested that Jephthah intended to dedicate a person to perpetual service at the sanctuary rather than to a literal sacrifice. Others take the text at its plain meaning. The weight of the narrative strongly suggests that Jephthah understood the full consequence of what he had promised, and that the text is describing a tragedy that followed from a rash vow made in a moment of spiritual desperation. Because when Jephthah returned victorious from Ammon, it was his daughter who came out of his house first, his only child, dancing with tambourines in celebration of her father's victory. When he saw her, the text says, he tore his clothes and cried out that she had brought him very low, for he had opened his mouth to the Lord and could not take it back. His daughter's response is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire Bible. She does not weep for herself first. She tells her father to do what he has vowed, since the Lord has given him vengeance on his enemies. She asks only for 2 months, to go to the mountains with her companions and weep, because she would never know marriage. 2 months, to grieve a life that would not be lived. And then she returned to her father, and the text states that he did to her according to his vow that he had made. Her name is never recorded. In a book full of named figures, kings and commanders, deceivers and heroes, the daughter of Jephthah is remembered by her relationship to her father, not by her own name. What the book of Judges is documenting in this passage goes beyond the tragedy of one young woman's life. It is documenting the spiritual recklessness that accompanies a faith that has been formed more by crisis than by covenant. Jephthah knew enough about God to call on him in battle, but he made a vow that reflected a transactional understanding of faith, a bargaining with the divine rather than a relationship built on trust. The law of Moses, recorded in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, contained explicit provisions for the redemption of vows involving human beings. There were paths available to Jephthah that he did not take or perhaps did not know. And this ignorance, combined with the honor culture that surrounded the keeping of public vows, led to a consequence that the text records with grief rather than endorsement. The annual commemoration mentioned at the end of the passage, that the daughters of Israel would go out to lament the daughter of Jephthah 4 days every year, is one of the most quietly remarkable details in the entire book. A whole people preserving the memory of a young woman whose name they never wrote down, returning year after year to mourn what was lost. The book of Judges does not tell us whether God approved of what Jephthah did. It does not pass that explicit judgment, but it records the sorrow with the fullness it deserves, and in that recording is its own kind of witness. Some things are not meant to be explained away. Some things are meant to be mourned. There are few figures in biblical literature whose story is more familiar and more misunderstood than Samson. He is the man with supernatural strength, the man who kills a lion with his bare hands, the man who brings down the pillars of the Philistine temple. He is, in the popular imagination, a figure of heroic power. But the book of Judges presents Samson very differently. His story begins before his birth, which is itself a sign of divine purpose. His mother was barren. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and told her that she would conceive and bear a son, and that no razor would ever touch his head, for the child would be a Nazirite from birth, dedicated to God from before his first breath. He would begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. The Nazirite vow, as described in Numbers 6, involved abstaining from wine and strong drink, from anything that came from the grapevine, from cutting the hair, and from contact with the dead. It was a vow of separation, a sign of being set apart for a holy purpose. Samson would violate every element of this vow, not immediately, but consistently, over time, in the choices that defined the direction of his life. His first recorded words in the text are not a declaration of purpose or a prayer of dedication. They are a demand addressed to his parents. "I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." Judges 14:2. His parents question the choice. Why take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines when there are women among his own people? But the text adds its own editorial note. Samson's father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines ruled over Israel. This is one of the most theologically complex statements in the book of Judges. God was working through Samson's choices, even the choices that were spiritually problematic, to accomplish a purpose against the oppressors of Israel. But this does not mean that every choice Samson made was righteous. It means that God's sovereignty is large enough to move through human failure without endorsing it. On the way to Timnah, Samson encounters a lion. The Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him, and he tears the lion apart. This should have been a moment of recognition, a demonstration of the power of God moving through him. Instead, on a return journey, Samson passes the carcass of the lion and finds that bees have made honey within it. He scrapes the honey with his hands and eats it. He gives some to his parents without telling them where it came from. A Nazirite touching the carcass of a dead animal, the vow of separation compromised quietly. The riddle he poses at his wedding feast is rooted in this hidden moment. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. The men of Timnah cannot solve it. They pressure Samson's wife until she extracts the answer from him with tears. She tells them. Samson, furious, speaks a verse that has echoed through time. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." Judges 14:18. The language itself reveals something about Samson's understanding of his wife, of the people around him. He moves through the world with great physical power and with wounds in the places where tenderness should live. His subsequent relationships follow the same pattern: strength on the outside, vulnerability and recklessness within. He goes to a prostitute in Gaza. He falls in love with Delilah. The story of Delilah is perhaps the most famous seduction narrative in all of Scripture. The lords of the Philistines approach her and offer each of them 1,100 pieces of silver if she can discover the secret of Samson's great strength. She agrees, and she asks Samson 3 times where his strength lies, and 3 times he deceives her, and 3 times the deception is tested, and he escapes. And then she asks again. She tells him that he has mocked her, that he does not love her, that he has not told her his heart. And the text records one of the most haunting verses in the book of Judges. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart. Judges 16:16-17. He told her all his heart. The man who could not be bound with cords could not resist persistent pressure from the woman he loved. The one who had defeated lions and armies and thousands of Philistines was brought down not by superior force, but by the slow wearing away of his resistance in a place he refused to protect. He slept. She called a man to shave his head. His strength left him. When the Philistines seized him, they put out his eyes and bound him with bronze shackles and made him grind at the mill in prison. The strongest man in Israel, blind, bound, and grinding grain like an animal. But the text adds a detail that the storyteller clearly considered important. The hair of his head began to grow again, and at a great feast of the Philistines, when they had drunk deeply and called for Samson to be brought out to entertain them, the blind man asked the boy who led him to let him feel the pillars of the temple. He stood between the 2 central pillars. He called on God, for the first time in the text, with a prayer that is entirely about others as well as himself. O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Judges 16:28. He pushed. The temple fell on the lords of the Philistines and on all the people in it. And the text records that the dead whom Samson killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Samson judged Israel for 20 years. He never united a tribe or organized an army. He never delivered a speech or offered a sacrifice. He fought alone, driven by personal grievances, shaped by personal loves and personal losses. The victories that God accomplished through him were real, and they were achieved through a man who never fully understood, or perhaps never fully accepted, the purpose for which he had been set apart before his birth. His is the story of wasted potential that is not beyond redemption. Even in blindness, even in chains, even at the end, there is a prayer, there is an answer. There is a final act that fulfills the beginning of his call. But the book of Judges does not allow the reader to romanticize the path that led there. The cost of Samson's life was Samson, and the tragedy of that is written on every page of his story. Hidden in the chapters of Judges 17 and 18 is a story so quietly disturbing that it rarely receives sustained attention. It does not have a famous judge at its center. It does not feature a great battle. It features something more unsettling. It features a religious system constructed entirely from compromise, theft, and spiritual convenience. The story begins with a man named Micah from the hill country of Ephraim. He confesses to his mother that he had stolen 1,100 pieces of silver from her. She had spoken a curse in his hearing about the missing money, and perhaps fearing that curse, he returns it to her. She responds with a blessing and dedicates the silver to the Lord. But the dedication takes a specific form. She gives 200 pieces of silver to a silversmith, who fashions from it a carved image and a metal image. These images are placed in the house of Micah. Micah also establishes a shrine and makes a priestly ephod, and he installs one of his sons as priest. The text provides its theological verdict with almost no additional commentary. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 17:6. This is the first occurrence of that phrase. It will return at the end of the book. Then a young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah arrives traveling in search of a place to live. Micah invites him to stay and serve as his priest. He offers the young man 10 pieces of silver a year, clothing, and his food. The young man agrees. Micah declares that now he knows the Lord will prosper him because he has a Levite as priest. The spiritual logic here is entirely transactional. Micah has built a private religious system outside of the authorized worship of Israel. He has idols in his house and a hired priest, and the confidence that God will bless him. The text presents this not as the story of a villain, but as the portrait of a man who genuinely believes he is honoring God. This is one of the most sobering dimensions of the story. Micah is not a cynical unbeliever. He is a sincere worshiper of the wrong things in the wrong way at the wrong location, with objects that the law of Moses explicitly prohibited. And then the tribe of Dan arrives. The Danites were searching for territory to settle. Their allotted portion in the land had not been secured, and they sent scouts to look for available land. These scouts pass through the hill country of Ephraim and come to the house of Micah. They recognize the voice of the young Levite and ask him to inquire of God whether their journey will succeed. The priest tells them to go in peace. The Lord is favorable to their mission. When the 600 armed men of Dan return later, they stop at Micah's house. The scouts point out the carved image, the ephod, the idols. The armed men take them. They also invite the Levite to come with them, to be priest not just to one household, but to an entire tribe. The Levite's heart is glad, the text says. He takes the ephod and the household gods and goes with the Danites. When Micah pursues them and asks why they have taken his gods and his priest, the Danites tell him to be quiet, or men angry in spirit will attack him and his household. Micah, outnumbered and unable to resist, returns home. The Danites settle in Laish. A city they describe as peaceful and unsuspecting. They attack it with the sword and burn it. Then they rebuild it, call it Dan, and set up the carved image for themselves. The Levite, whose name is finally revealed as Jonathan the son of Gershom, becomes priest, and the text makes a genealogical statement of striking significance. He was the son of Gershom, son of Moses, a grandson of Moses, serving as priest over an idolatrous shrine in Dan. The descendants of Jonathan serve as priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. What the book of Judges is documenting in these 2 chapters is a process of religious deterioration that happens gradually, step by step, each decision building on the last. A mother who sincerely dedicates silver to God, but channels that dedication into idol-making. A son who builds a shrine that blends the appearance of Israelite worship with prohibited objects. A Levite who trades his calling for a salary. An entire tribe that constructs its religious identity from stolen goods. None of these people appear to believe they are doing something wrong. Each is doing what seems right in their own eyes. And this is precisely what makes the story so difficult. The most dangerous forms of spiritual corruption are not always the ones that feel like corruption. They are the ones that feel like devotion. The book of Judges ends with a sequence of events so violent in historical consequence and so morally complex that many readers simply stop reading. It occupies the final 3 chapters of the book, Judges 19, 20, and 21, and it describes the near extinction of an entire tribe of Israel. It begins on a dark road with a Levite traveling with his concubine. The Levite had gone to bring back his concubine from her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah. The text does not idealize the relationship. She had been unfaithful to him and had returned to her father's house. He came to speak tenderly to her and bring her back. After days of hospitality, they departed late in the afternoon. They traveled until the evening near Gibeah, which belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. They entered the city and sat in the open square, waiting for someone to offer them hospitality. No one came. Finally, an old man returning from his work in the field noticed them and invited them to stay with him. He warned them not to spend the night in the open square. That night the men of the city surrounded the house, beating on the door, demanding that the old man send out his guest so that they might know him. The language is unambiguous. The men of Gibeah intended a violent assault upon the Levite. What follows is one of the most painful passages in the entire Bible. The Levite's concubine is given to the men outside. The text records what happens to her through the night with restrained language that nonetheless communicates the full weight of the atrocity. When morning came, the Levite opened the door to leave, and she was there on the threshold, fallen. He told her to get up. She did not answer. He had her carried home. And then he cut her body into 12 pieces and sent them throughout all of Israel. The text records the response of the people. All who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." Judges 19:30. The congregation assembled at Mizpah. 400,000 men bearing swords from across all the tribes of Israel. The Levite told them what had happened. He called for them to respond. The people of Israel went to Benjamin first and demanded that the guilty men of Gibeah be handed over for justice. The tribe of Benjamin refused to listen. They mobilized for war to defend Gibeah. 26,000 swordsmen from Benjamin and 700 specially chosen men from Gibeah, described as left-handed men who could sling a stone at a hare and not miss, stood against the assembled tribes of Israel. Israel inquired of God twice who should go first into battle against Benjamin, and twice they suffered crushing defeats. 22,000 Israelites fell the first day. 18,000 fell the second day. The people wept, they fasted, they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and on the third day they inquired again. This time God told them to go, that he would give Benjamin into their hand. The third battle used an ambush strategy. An ambushing force was hidden near Gibeah. The main body of Israel retreated and drew the Benjaminites out of the city. Then the ambush force entered the city and set it on fire. When the Benjaminites turned and saw the smoke rising from their city, and the main army turned to fight, they were surrounded. 25,000 swordsmen of Benjamin fell that day. 600 men of Benjamin escaped to the wilderness and hid at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. But the cities of Benjamin were burned. Their inhabitants were killed. Their livestock were killed. When the grief of near-total annihilation settled over Israel, they recognized something terrible. An oath had been made at Mizpah. No one from the gathered tribes would give his daughter as wife to a man of Benjamin. With the tribe of Benjamin reduced to 600 men and no women of their own people, a tribe of Israel stood on the edge of disappearance. The solution that followed is itself a source of grave moral difficulty. The people discovered that the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead had not come to the assembly at Mizpah. They sent 12,000 men to attack Jabesh-Gilead, killing all who had not come, and sparing only the young women who had not known a man. 400 such women were found and brought to the camp. There were still not enough for all 600 men of Benjamin. The elders of Israel devised a second plan. The annual feast of the Lord at Shiloh was approaching. They told the remaining Benjaminites to hide in the vineyards and watch. When the daughters of Shiloh came out to dance in the celebration, each Benjaminite was to seize one for himself and bring her home as his wife. And if the fathers or brothers of these women came to complain, Israel would speak on behalf of the Benjaminites, telling them that they had, in a technical sense, not violated the oath, since they had not given their daughters willingly. This reasoning, this attempt to find a way around the consequences of a rash oath by constructing a technicality, is presented by the text without endorsement. It is recorded as what happened, as what people without a king, without spiritual leadership, without a centered covenantal identity chose to do, and the book closes with its final devastating verse. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25. This is not a verse about political theory. It is not primarily a call for monarchy. It is a theological statement about what happens to a people when they have no authoritative center, when the law of God is not the shaping force of individual conscience, when the community's sense of right and wrong is determined by each person's internal scale rather than by a revealed standard. The tribe of Benjamin survived. It would later produce Israel's first king, Saul, of the tribe of Benjamin. And generations beyond that, it would produce the Apostle Paul, who described himself in his letter to the Philippians as a Hebrew of Hebrews, of the tribe of Benjamin. The people who stood at the edge of extinction were not erased, but the path that brought them to that edge, the accumulated compromises of a people who forgot what they were called to be, is recorded in full. The 7 secrets we have explored in these pages are not secrets in the sense of being hidden from the text. They are secrets in the sense of being hidden from comfortable reading. They are the parts of the book of Judges that require a reader to sit longer, to resist the impulse to move past the difficulty, to ask what is being said, and why the sacred text chose to say it this way. The cycle of spiritual abandonment and return, the calling of those whom the world overlooked when the chosen hesitated, the tragedy of a great deliverer who built an idol after his greatest victory, the grief of a young woman who went to the mountains with her companions and wept for a life she would not be allowed to live, the loneliness of a man of enormous power who could not protect the truest part of himself, the quiet corruption of sincere people who built their religion from theft and convenience, and the near destruction of a tribe brought about not by foreign enemies but by the moral collapse of an entire community. These are not stories from a foreign age that bear no relationship to the present. They are stories about the human condition, about the persistence of spiritual amnesia, about the cost of forgetting, about the pattern that reasserts itself whenever a community loses the thread of its covenant identity. The book of Judges is not a book of easy heroes. It is a book of honest witnesses. And what those witnesses testify to, across every page, across every generation, through every failure and every recovery, is that the question of who will rule the human heart does not resolve itself on its own. It must be answered, consciously, deliberately, in every generation. Because the alternative, everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, has a history, and that history is written in the book of Judges.